Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
In this video, we'll learn how to add drop shadows and inner shadows to HTML elements with the CSS Box Shadow property. Let's get started. So let's create a basic box shadow for our div element on the page with the class of box. In our box CSS rule, we'll go ahead and create the box shadow declaration followed by its values. So let's go over what each value means. The first value in our box shadow declaration is the horizontal offset. It can be any valid CSS length unit and can be a positive or negative value. So here we're offsetting it to the right by 20 pixels. A positive value will move the shadow to the right, and a negative value will move the shadow to the left. The second value is the vertical offset. Like the horizontal offset, it can be any of the valid length units, positive or negative. A positive value will move the shadow down, and a negative value moves the shadow up. So we're also making this 20 pixels. At the very least, these two values alone will create a box shadow. But as we can see here, it seems a little flat and lacking depth. Now, this could very well be the effect you're going for, and that's fine. But let's continue with the other values to make this look a little more realistic. The third value in our box shadow property is an optional value that sets the shadow's blur radius. The blur radius determines how blurry or sharp the shadow should be. A value of 0 gives us a shadow with sharp edges, which is what we're seeing here. So the larger the value gets, the blurrier and lighter the shadow will appear. So let's go ahead and give it a blur radius of 30 pixels. When we refresh, we can see how that softens our box shadow, and there seems to be more depth between the div and the background. Back in our CSS, the fourth value is also an optional spread radius value that is extremely useful for defining the spread distance of our box shadow. Positive values cause the shadow to expand in all directions by the specified radius. We'll add a 20 pixel spread radius, which, as you can see, it spreads the shadow out 20 pixels from the center of the shadow. Using a negative value causes the shadow to shrink and contract. So let's go ahead and change it to -10. And you can see how it sort of contracted behind the div. So with the negative spread radius, we can sort of squeeze in the box shadow, which can create some interesting shadow effects. For example, by changing the X offset to 0, when we refresh, we can see that we get this subtle floating box effect here from the shadow. Finally, the fifth value specifies the color of the box shadow. So we'll go ahead and use an RGBA value of black with an 80% opacity. The color value needs to be placed before or after the length values. Otherwise, the entire line will be ignored. And keep in mind that if the box shadow color is not specified, the browser will render the shadow according to the element's color property. By default, box shadows are created as drop shadows outside of the element. If we want to create an inner shadow, we can add a value of Inset. The Inset value must be declared either first or last, otherwise the entire line will be ignored. So let's go ahead and change these offset values really quick here. We'll make the X offset 10, the Y offset 10, and we'll add a 5 pixel blur radius. When we refresh, we can see that the shadow is now inside of our div element. But what if we want the shadow to be even on all sides? We can do that by setting both offsets to 0. Then use the blur and spread radius values to adjust the shadow. So we will make the blur radius 6 pixels and the spread radius 4 pixels. I'll go ahead and remove the shadow color. When we refresh, now we can see that the shadow is inset evenly on all 4 sides, which gives us a nice inner shadow effect. We can also apply multiple box shadows to an element. In our box shadow property, all we need to do is separate each box shadow value with a comma within the same declaration. Just remember that the first shadow specified will appear on top, and the last one will appear at the very bottom. When we refresh the page, there we see the multiple box shadows applied to our div. Browser support is looking great for box shadows as they're supported by all the major browsers. In the next video, we'll go over border properties we can use to draw images on the borders of elements.